If you sign that at 10 a.m., you won't own this company by noon. The words didn't come from the legal team. They didn't come from the CFO or the row of tailored executives seated along the polished glass table. They came from the back of the room, from a man no one had noticed until he spoke. The room froze. Not metaphorically, actually. Pins stopped midair. A chair creaked once, then went still. Even the soft hum of the air conditioning seemed louder than it should have been. Ethan Caldwell's hand hovered inches above the contract. Mont-Blanc pen poised, signature seconds away from sealing a multi-billion-dollar merger that had taken 6 months to negotiate. His jaw tightened. Slowly, he turned his head. The man standing near the wall held a mop handle in one hand and a folded gray rag in the other. Dark uniform. Name tag slightly worn. Marcus Reed. The janitor. Ethan blinked once, like his brain needed to reset the image before him. What did you just say? His voice was calm, controlled, but colder now. Marcus didn't move closer. Didn't shrink either. He just stood there, posture straight, eyes steady, not defiant, not afraid. Certain, I said, Marcus repeated, voice even. That clause you're about to sign, it flips the liability. If anything goes wrong after this deal closes, your company takes the fall, not theirs. A few people let out short, disbelieving breaths. Someone near the end of the table actually laughed. Quick, sharp, uncomfortable. Is this a joke? One of the attorneys muttered, not bothering to lower his voice. Another executive leaned back, arms crossed. Who let him in here? Ethan didn't answer them. His eyes stayed locked on Marcus. Studying. Measuring. Then, without looking away, he spoke, security. The word landed heavy. Immediate. A guard near the door stepped forward, hesitant but ready. Marcus didn't resist. Didn't argue. But before the guard could reach him, he added one more sentence, quieter this time. Almost like it was meant only for Ethan. Page 14. Third paragraph. It's written to look harmless. It's not. Silence again. Thicker now. Ethan's fingers tightened slightly around the pen. For a brief second, it looked like he might just sign anyway. Dismiss it. End it. Move on. That's what power does. It ignores what it doesn't expect. But his hand didn't move. Not forward. Not yet. Around the table, people shifted subtly. A throat. Cleared. Someone tapped a tablet screen, pretending to check something else. The guard paused, glancing between Ethan and Marcus, unsure which way this moment would break. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose, then lowered the pen just enough to rest it against the paper without touching ink to page. Page 14, he repeated under his breath. No one spoke. No one dared rush him. Because something had changed, just slightly, but enough. The kind of shift you feel before a storm turns. Ethan reached forward, flipped the stack of documents with precise movements, each page sliding over the next with a soft, controlled sound. Page 10, 11, 12, 13. Then he stopped. His eyes scanned. Once, twice, and then his jaw flexed. Barely, but it was there. A micro-expression. The kind most people would miss. Marcus didn't miss it. He just stood there, still holding that mop like it weighed nothing, watching not like an intruder, but like someone who had already seen the ending before anyone else in the room realized there was a problem at all. The line on page 14 did not shout. It did not warn. It sat there quietly, dressed in clean legal language, tucked between paragraphs that sounded safe, balanced, routine. Ethan's eyes moved across it once more, slower now, his breathing measured, almost too controlled. Around him, the room held its silence like it was afraid to break it. The attorney on his right leaned slightly forward, trying to read Ethan's expression, but there was nothing to read. That was the problem. Ethan Caldwell had built his empire on control, on never letting a single flicker of doubt show. But now his fingers pressed just a little harder against the paper, enough to crease the edge. Explain it, he said finally, voice low, not looking up. It was not directed at anyone in particular, but everyone understood who it was meant for. The guard stopped completely. All eyes shifted back to Marcus. For a second, no one moved. Then Marcus took one small step forward, careful, measured, like stepping onto thin ice. He set the rag down on the edge of a nearby side table, freeing his hands. The wording makes it look like shared post-merger responsibility, Marcus said, his voice steady but not loud. But it is not. It redirects all downstream liability to your company if any compliance issue appears after closing. even if it comes from their side. A faint scoff came from the far end. That is standard language. One of the senior lawyers cut in quickly. It has been reviewed multiple times. Marcus did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply nodded once, as if he expected that reaction. It is standard, he agreed. Until you read the last sentence of the clause. Ethan's eyes did not leave the page. His thumb shifted slightly, tracing the exact line Marcus had pointed out. There it was. One sentence. Longer than the others. Denser. Easy to skim past. But now, under Marcus's words, it read differently. Not neutral. Not harmless. A quiet shift of responsibility. Subtle. Intentional. Permanent. Ethan's jaw tightened again, this time a fraction more visible. The attorney beside him leaned in. Sir, if you are concerned, we can revisit. Quiet. The word was soft, but it cut through the room instantly. The attorney leaned back. No one else spoke. Ethan read it again. And then again. Each time, the meaning settled heavier. This was not a mistake. This was design. Across the room, Marcus stood still, hands relaxed at his sides. Not pushing, not interrupting. Just waiting. The kind of patience that did not come from confidence, but from certainty. Ethan finally lifted his gaze. Not to the lawyers. Not to the executives. Straight to Marcus. How did you catch this? The question hung there, stripped of ego, stripped of dismissal. Just a question. Marcus hesitated for the first time, not because he did not know the answer, but because he understood what the question really meant. Why are you not invisible? He glanced briefly at the contract, then back at Ethan. I read things, he said simply. A few people shifted uncomfortably. That answer did not fit the image they had already decided for him. Ethan held his gaze a second longer, then looked back down at the document in his hands. The pen was still resting against the paper. But now, it felt heavier. Much heavier. And for the first time since the meeting began, Ethan Caldwell did not look like a man in control of the outcome. He looked like a man who had almost missed something that could have erased everything he had built. No one reached for their phone. No one whispered. The room had shifted into something tighter, sharper, like every person suddenly understood that whatever happened next would matter more than the deal itself. Ethan did not speak right away. He turned one more page back, then forward again, as if hoping the meaning might change depending on where he stood in the document. It did not. The sentence stayed the same. Cold. Precise. Final. Who drafted this section? He asked, still looking down. A man across the table straightened immediately, adjusting his tie. Our partners provided the base draft, he said carefully. Our team reviewed and approved the language. Approved. The word lingered in the air like something fragile. Ethan's thumb tapped once against the margin of the page, a small, controlled movement, but it broke the stillness just enough to make everyone else aware of their own breathing again. Reviewed. Ethan repeated quietly, as if testing the word for weight. Then he closed the folder halfway, not fully, just enough to signal that the momentum had stopped. The guard near Marcus shifted his stance, uncertain now whether he was still supposed to escort him out or not. Marcus did not move. He remained where he was, neither invited nor dismissed, his presence now impossible to ignore. One of the executives leaned forward, voice cautious. Ethan, we are minutes away from finalizing this. If we delay, it could signal uncertainty to the other side. Ethan finally looked up, but not at him. His gaze moved slowly across the table, one face at a time. Lawyers, advisors, people who were paid to see what others missed. And yet, none of them had said a word about the line that now sat like a fault line under the entire deal. He leaned back slightly in his chair, the leather creaking softly under the shift of weight. Uncertainty, he said, almost to himself. Or awareness. No one answered. Because there was no safe answer to that. Ethan turned his head again, eyes landing back on Marcus. This time, there was no dismissal in his expression. No irritation. Just a quiet, deliberate focus. Walk me through it, he said. Not a command. Not a test. An invitation. A few people exchanged quick glances, surprised by the shift in tone more than anything else. Marcus hesitated for half a second, then stepped closer to the table. Not too close. Just enough to see clearly. He did not touch the contract. Did not assume permission. He simply pointed, hovering his finger just above the page. Right here, he said. This part references future compliance triggers. It sounds mutual, but the last sentence overrides that. It says enforcement responsibility defaults to the acquiring entity if any ambiguity exists. That means you. Ethan followed his finger, reading as Marcus spoke, the words aligning differently now. Each clause no longer separate, but connected, forming something intentional. Designed. Around them, the room stayed quiet, but it was no longer disbelief. It was recognition. One of the attorneys shifted in his seat, his earlier confidence gone, replaced by something tighter, less certain. That interpretation is aggressive, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Marcus did not argue. He just stepped back again, returning to where he had been, as if his role was never to convince, only to reveal. Ethan closed the folder completely this time. The sound was soft, but it landed like a decision. His pen remained in his hand, and used. And for the first time since the meeting began, the outcome was no longer moving forward. It was suspended, waiting on what one man would choose to do next, and whether he was willing to accept that the most important voice in the room had come from the one person no one had planned to hear. The folder stayed closed in Ethan's hand, but the weight of it had changed. It no longer felt like a formality. It felt like a decision that could not be undone. He rested it slowly on the table, not pushing it forward, not pulling it back, just placing it there like something fragile that required distance. Around him, the executives shifted again, but more carefully now, as if any sudden movement might break whatever balance had just formed in the room. The clock on the far wall clicked once. Then again. 9:58 a.m. 2 minutes. The deal had been scheduled down to the second. Every call aligned, every signature timed. Precision had always been Ethan's advantage. But now precision was the problem. Because the closer it got to 10, the harder it would be to stop everything without consequence. "We need to proceed," one of the senior advisors said, his voice lower than before, but still carrying urgency. Delays at this stage could affect market confidence. Ethan did not respond. He kept his eyes on the contract, but he was no longer reading it. He was thinking, calculating, replaying the last 10 minutes in his mind with the kind of clarity that came only when something almost went wrong. Across the table, another executive leaned in, more cautious this time. "If there is even a small concern, we can request clarification after signing. That is standard practice." That suggestion hung in the air for a moment. Almost reasonable, almost safe. Marcus's gaze shifted slightly, not interrupting, not reacting, but there was something in his stillness that made the suggestion feel incomplete. Ethan noticed. He always noticed what others missed. That was how he had built everything. And now, for the first time in a long time, he was realizing he had almost missed something that mattered more than speed, more than perception, more than timing. He lifted his hand from the table, the pen still between his fingers, then set it down beside the folder instead. Not dramatically, just enough to signal a pause. "If we sign," Ethan said slowly, his voice controlled but different now, "there is no clarification after." The advisor opened his mouth, then stopped. Because that was true, and everyone in the room knew it. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Not confusion, not disbelief, understanding. Ethan turned his head slightly toward Marcus again, but this time he did not ask a question. He studied him, the way he would study a report, a trend, a risk. Marcus stood the same as before. No shift in posture. No expectation in his expression. Just quiet presence. As if he had already said everything he needed to say. Ethan looked back at the table, then at the faces around it. People who had built careers on being right. People who were now waiting for him to decide which version of reality would move forward. The safe one, or the true one. The clock ticked again. 9:59 a.m. 1 minute. Ethan exhaled, slow and steady, then reached forward, not for the pen, but for the edge of the contract. He slid it a few inches away from himself. That small movement echoed louder than any statement he could have made. A few heads turned immediately. One of the lawyers straightened sharply in his chair. "Ethan, we are not signing this," he said. Calm. Final. No raised voice. No hesitation. Just a decision that did not ask for agreement. The words settled over the room like a line drawn in place. No one spoke right away. No one could, because the momentum of weeks had just been stopped in a single sentence. Ethan leaned back in his chair again, his gaze steady now, clearer than it had been all morning. "Set up a full review," he added. "Every clause. Every reference. We do it right. or we do not do it at all. Across the room, the guard took a small step back, no longer needed. Marcus remained where he was, but something had shifted, not in how he stood, but in how the room saw him. Not invisible anymore. Not background. Not just the man with the mop. And Ethan knew it, even if no one said it out loud. Because 10 seconds ago, he had been about to sign away everything. And the only person who had stopped him had been the one person no one had planned to listen to. No one moved for a full second after the decision landed. It was not shock anymore. It was recalibration. The kind that happens when the future you expected quietly disappears and something else takes its place. Papers remained untouched. Screens stayed lit but forgotten. The energy in the room, once sharp and forward-driving, had shifted into something slower, heavier, more deliberate. Ethan rested both hands lightly on the table, fingers relaxed now, no longer gripping anything. The pressure had not vanished, but it had changed direction. It was no longer about speed. It was about understanding what had almost happened. "Cancel the 10 o'clock confirmation call," he said, without raising his voice. His assistant nodded immediately, already reaching for her tablet, her movements quick but careful, like she did not want to disturb the new stillness. One of the lawyers cleared his throat, softer this time. "We should notify the other party with a neutral explanation. Frame it as a procedural review." Ethan nodded once. "Do that." No argument. No debate. Just alignment. But even as instructions were given, attention kept drifting back toward the same point in the room. Marcus. He had not stepped forward again. Had not spoken since Ethan made the call. He simply stood near the wall, where he had always been, one hand loosely resting on the mop handle, as if the last 15 minutes had not changed anything about his role. But it had. Everyone could feel it. One of the younger analysts glanced at him, then quickly looked away, unsure how long it was appropriate to look. Another executive adjusted his glasses, studying Marcus in a different way now, not as background, but as a variable that had not been accounted for. Ethan noticed all of it. He noticed the shift in posture, the subtle reordering of attention, the way silence now formed around Marcus instead of pushing past him. Ethan stood up slowly. Not abrupt. Not dramatic. The chair slid back with a soft sound against the floor. Immediately, a few others straightened instinctively, as if expecting the meeting to end. But Ethan did not dismiss anyone. Instead, he walked around the table, each step measured, until he stopped a few feet in front of Marcus. Close enough to speak without raising his voice. Far enough to keep space. For a brief moment, neither of them said anything. The distance between them felt smaller than it looked. "You saw it before any of us did," Ethan said finally. It was not a question. Marcus met his gaze, calm as before. "Yes, sir." No pride. No hesitation. Just truth. Ethan nodded slightly, absorbing that answer, then glanced briefly at the mop, then back at Marcus. "How long have you been working here?" "About 11 months, Marcus replied. Ethan's eyes narrowed just a fraction, not in suspicion, but in thought. 11 months. Enough time to learn patterns. Enough time to see things others ignored. Enough time to understand the rhythm of a place without ever being invited into its center. Ethan let out a quiet breath, then spoke again, his tone lower now, more personal than before. "And in 11 months, no one asked you what you notice." It was not framed as a question, but Marcus answered anyway. "No, sir." The simplicity of it settled heavily between them. Behind Ethan, no one interrupted. No one shifted. The entire room seemed to lean into the silence without moving. Ethan gave a small nod, almost to himself, then stepped back half a pace, creating just enough space to reset the moment. "We are going to review everything," he said, voice returning to its steady, controlled cadence. "And I want you there when we do." That landed differently. Not loud, but undeniable. A few heads lifted slightly. Someone inhaled sharply, then stopped. Themselves. Marcus did not react immediately. For the first time, there was the slightest pause in him, not uncertainty, but surprise contained within discipline. "Sir," he said carefully, "I am just." Ethan cut him off, but gently. "You are the reason we are not making a $10 billion mistake right now." He held Marcus's gaze, not challenging, not testing, just stating a fact that no one in the room could deny anymore. The silence that followed was no longer uncomfortable. It was clear, defined, and in that clarity, something had shifted completely. Not just the outcome of a deal, But who, in that room, would be heard from this moment forward? No one spoke after Ethan's words. Not because they did not have something to say, but because anything said too quickly would feel misplaced. The room had entered a different rhythm now, one that did not belong to urgency or authority, but to recognition. Marcus stood still, his hand resting lightly on the mop handle, but his posture had changed in a way that was almost invisible unless you were looking for it. Not taller, not prouder, just acknowledged. Ethan turned slightly, glancing back at the table, then at his team. "Clear the next hour," he said. "No interruptions." His assistant nodded again, already moving, her fingers tapping across the screen with quiet efficiency. Meetings were being shifted, calls postponed. A schedule that had been locked down to the minute was now bending around a single decision. Ethan walked back to his chair, but did not sit immediately. Instead, he opened the folder again, this time not as a formality, but as a problem to be solved. "Bring up the full contract on the main display," he said. A large screen at the front of the room flickered to life, lines of dense legal text appearing in sharp contrast against the white background. The clause on page 14 was enlarged, each word now impossible to skim past. Ethan stepped aside slightly, his gaze shifting between the screen and Marcus. "Show me exactly where it breaks," he said. There was no hesitation in his tone now. No doubt about who he was asking. A few of the attorneys exchanged quick glances, subtle, controlled, but unmistakable. This was not how this room usually worked. Expertise had a hierarchy, and Marcus was not supposed to be anywhere near the top of it. Marcus hesitated for just a second, not out of fear, but out of habit. Then he stepped forward. He set the mop gently against the wall, the soft tap of it against the paneling barely audible, but it marked something. A shift. His hands were free now. He looked at the screen, eyes scanning quickly, not rushed, not overwhelmed, but familiar. "Start here," he said, pointing to a paragraph above the clause. "This section defines shared responsibility. That is what it wants you to believe." His finger moved slightly lower. "Then this sentence changes the structure. It introduces conditional language. In the event of unresolved ambiguity." "That sounds neutral." He paused, letting the words sit. The room leaned in without moving. "But it is not neutral," Marcus continued, "because the next line assigns final interpretation authority to the acquiring entity. That means any ambiguity becomes your responsibility to resolve. And once you resolve it, you own the outcome." Ethan's eyes followed every word. He was not just listening. He was reconstructing the logic in real time. One of the senior lawyers shifted in his seat, his earlier confidence now replaced with something quieter. "That is a narrow reading," he said, but the certainty was gone. Marcus did not look at him. He kept his focus on the screen. "It is the only reading that holds up if something goes wrong," he replied calmly. "And contracts are not written for when things go right." That landed, harder than anything else had. A silence followed, but this time it was different. Not tense, not frozen. It was the kind of silence that comes when something becomes undeniable. Ethan stepped closer to the screen, his hand lifting slightly as if to touch the words, but stopping just short. He could see it now, not as text, as consequence. His reflection faintly appeared in the glass surface of the display, layered over the clause itself, like a reminder of who would carry that consequence if it went wrong. He lowered his hand slowly, then turned his head just enough to look at Marcus again, not as the janitor, not as the interruption, but as the only person in the room who had seen clearly when it mattered. And for the first time that morning, Ethan did not feel like the smartest man in the room. He felt like the one who had almost missed the most important thing. The screen remained lit, the clause still magnified, but no one was looking at it the same way anymore. It was no longer just text. It was intent. It was strategy. And now that it had been exposed, it could not be unseen. Ethan stepped back from the display slowly, his eyes still fixed on the words, but his mind already moving ahead, mapping consequences, tracing outcomes. "If we had signed," he said quietly, not to anyone in particular, "we would have absorbed every failure they buried in this." No one corrected him. No one tried to soften it. Because now they all saw it too. One of the senior partners leaned forward, fingers interlocked, voice lower than before. This was deliberate. It was not framed as a question. Marcus did not respond immediately. He looked at the screen one more time, then back at Ethan. It reads like it was designed to pass review, he said, not to hold up under pressure. That distinction settled into the room like a line drawn in ink. Designed to pass review, not to survive reality. Ethan nodded once, slowly, the implication clear. This was not just a bad clause. It was a test. A filter. A way to see who was paying attention and who was not. And for a moment, the realization tightened something in his chest. Because he knew exactly what it meant to miss something like that. He turned toward his legal team, his gaze sharper now, not angry, but focused in a way that demanded honesty. How did this get through? The question was direct, but not loud. The kind of question that did not need volume to carry weight. The lead attorney adjusted his glasses, buying a second of time that did not help. It is structured within acceptable parameters, he said carefully. It does not raise immediate red flags unless, he stopped. Because the rest of that sentence was already standing in the room. Unless someone looks closely enough. Ethan did not press him. He did not need to. The answer had already revealed itself. Systems had worked. Processes had been followed. But attention had slipped. And that was enough. He exhaled once, then turned slightly, his eyes finding Marcus again. You said you read things, Ethan said. What made you stop on this? Marcus's gaze dropped briefly to the floor. Not out of discomfort, but reflection. Then he looked back up. It did not match the rest, he said. Everything before it builds balance. That line breaks it. A small pause. And when something breaks the pattern, it usually matters. The simplicity of it landed deeper than any technical explanation could have. Around the table, a few people shifted again, but this time it was different. Not defensive. Not dismissive. It was the quiet recognition that something fundamental had just been said in the simplest possible way. Ethan held that for a moment, then gave a slight nod, more to himself than anyone else. Pattern. Break. Consequence. He turned back to the screen, then reached for the remote on the table, dimming the display slightly. The harsh white light softened, reflecting less glare, more clarity. We missed the pattern, he said quietly. No accusation. No blame. Just truth. The room did not respond, but the silence that followed carried agreement. Ethan placed the remote down, then rested his hand on the table again, steady now. We do not miss it again, he added. It was not a command. It was a standard, and everyone in the room understood it. Across from him, Marcus stepped back slightly, instinctively returning toward the edge of the space, as if his part was done. But the room did not let him fade the way it had before. Not anymore. Because once someone shows you what you missed, you cannot go back to seeing them as invisible. And Ethan knew that more clearly than anyone else in that moment. The room did not return to normal. It could not. Something fundamental had shifted, not just in the contract, but in how attention itself moved through the space. Conversations that would normally restart quickly after a decision stayed paused, as if everyone needed a moment longer to adjust to what had just happened. Ethan remained standing, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the table, his gaze no longer on the screen, but somewhere between the people in the room and the thought forming behind his eyes. Pull the rest of their previous agreements, he said, his voice steady but quieter now. Every deal they have structured in the last 5 years. His legal team reacted immediately, fingers moving, screens lighting up, the quiet rhythm of work resuming, but more focused than before. This was no longer about one clause. It was about a pattern, and patterns, once revealed, had a way of repeating unless they were understood. Marcus watched without stepping forward again. He had returned to his place near the wall, the mop still leaning where he had left it, but his attention remained fixed on the process, not as an outsider, but as someone tracking the same logic from a different angle. Ethan noticed. Of course he did. He turned slightly, just enough to include Marcus in his line of sight, without making it a spectacle. If they built this once, Ethan continued, addressing the room but aware of Marcus, they have built it before. One of the analysts nodded, already pulling up documents, scrolling quickly, searching for language that matched the structure Marcus had pointed out. I am seeing similar phrasing in a prior acquisition, the analyst said after a moment, his voice tight with realization. Different wording, same conditional trigger. That landed quietly, but heavily. It confirmed what had already begun to take shape. This was not an isolated risk. It was a strategy. Ethan exhaled slowly, the weight of that understanding settling into something more precise. Highlight every instance, he said. I want them side by side. The screen shifted again, now showing multiple documents, lines marked, phrases repeated with slight variations, like echoes of the same idea hidden across different deals. The pattern was undeniable now, and the room felt it. A few of the senior executives exchanged brief glances, not defensive anymore, but recalibrating, adjusting their understanding of the situation in real time. Ethan stepped closer to the display again, studying the highlighted sections, but this time he did not need to search as hard. Once he knew what to look for, it became easier to see. He turned his head slightly, looking back at Marcus. You caught it in one pass, he said. Again, not a question. Marcus gave a small nod. It stood out, he replied simply. Ethan held that answer for a moment, then looked back at the screen, then at the team around him. People who had been trained to see risk, to anticipate outcomes, to protect the structure. And yet, the first clear signal had come from someone outside that structure entirely. He rested his hand against the table again, fingers relaxed, his voice lowering just enough to change the tone of the room. We rely on process, he said. But process only works if someone is willing to question it. No one responded. They did not need to. The statement settled as truth, not critique. Marcus shifted his weight slightly, preparing, almost instinctively, to step back into the background, to let the room return to its usual hierarchy now that the immediate problem had been identified. But Ethan spoke again before that could happen. Stay, he said, not loud, but clear. Just one word. It stopped Marcus's movement without force. He did not step forward. He did not step back. He simply remained where he was. And in that stillness, the room adjusted once more, making space for a voice it had not expected, but now understood it could not ignore. The screen filled with marked clauses, each one a variation of the same quiet shift, each one carrying the same hidden weight. And the more they appeared, the less it looked like coincidence, and the more it looked like design, intentional, repeated, refined over time, and the room could feel it settling into something undeniable, something that changed not just this deal, but every assumption that had led up to it. Ethan stood still for a moment, his eyes moving across the highlighted sections, not rushing, not reacting outwardly, but absorbing, recalibrating, building a new understanding piece by piece. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more controlled than before. They have been doing this for years, he said, not as a guess, but as a conclusion, and no one challenged it, because the evidence was right there, layered across the screen, repeating the same pattern with slight variations, like a signature hidden in plain sight. One of the senior attorneys leaned forward. Again, slower this time, his tone stripped of earlier certainty. If that is the case, then walking away from this deal may not be enough, he said carefully. We may need to reassess every interaction we have had with them. Ethan nodded once, his gaze still fixed on the screen. We will, he said, simple, direct, final, and then he turned slightly, not fully, just enough for his voice to carry across the room without needing to rise. But first, we understand exactly how far this goes. The analysts moved quickly, pulling additional files, cross-referencing language, building a clearer map of the pattern, the room. Now fully engaged, but in a different way, no longer rushing toward an outcome, but digging into the structure beneath it. Marcus remained where he was, watching, not inserting himself, not claiming space. But his presence had weight now, the kind that did not need to be announced. Ethan noticed again, and this time, there was something else in his expression, not just recognition, but respect forming quietly. He stepped closer to the table, resting his hand lightly against it, grounding himself in the moment. Then he looked back at Marcus, holding his gaze a second longer than before. You saw the break in the pattern, Ethan said, his tone thoughtful, almost reflective. Before anyone else, Marcus did not shift, did not step forward. He simply answered, yes, sir, steady, unchanged. Ethan nodded slightly, then glanced back at the screen, then back at Marcus again, as if aligning two different perspectives into one. What would you check next? He asked, and that question changed the air in the room again, not because it was loud, but because of what it meant. A few heads lifted subtly, a few shoulders straightened, not in resistance, but in attention, because now the question was not coming from above. It was opening space where none had existed before. Marcus paused, just briefly, not uncertain, but careful. Then he looked at the screen again, scanning the clauses, the structure, the repetition. I would look at termination triggers, he said, calm, precise. If they built risk into the agreement, they probably built exits that protect them when it activates. The words landed quietly, but the impact was immediate. One of the analysts froze for half a second, then began typing faster, pulling up another section of the contract, searching, and within seconds, new highlights appeared on the screen, smaller clauses, buried deeper, but connected, reinforcing the same structure Marcus had just described. A soft exhale moved through the room, not dramatic, but collective, the kind that comes when something clicks into place. Ethan watched the new highlights appear, his expression tightening just slightly, not in anger, but in clarity. There it is, he said under his breath. And this time, no one needed to ask what he meant, because they all saw it now. The pattern, the intent, the full shape of what had almost been signed. And for a moment, the room did not feel like a boardroom at all. It felt like something else, something quieter, more honest, where titles mattered less than insight, where attention mattered more than authority. And standing near the wall, still in the same uniform, still holding nothing but quiet certainty, Marcus Reed had become the one point in the room that everything else was now aligning around. The new clauses appeared on the screen like quiet confirmations, each one reinforcing the same structure Marcus had pointed out, and the deeper they went, the clearer it became that this was not just a clever contract. It was a system designed to win even when it looked fair. Ethan stood there for a moment without speaking, his eyes moving across the highlighted termination triggers, tracing the logic from start to finish. And for the first time since the meeting began, there was something else. Beneath his calm, not panic, not anger, but something sharper, something closer to realization. If we had signed this, he said slowly, they would have controlled how and when we fail. The room stayed silent, because no one could argue with that anymore. One of the senior advisors leaned forward, his voice quieter than it had been all morning. And they would have had clean exits every time, he added, almost as if completing the thought. Ethan nodded once, his gaze still on the screen. Exactly, he said. Then he turned, not toward the screen this time, but toward the table, toward the people who had trusted the process, who had followed every step correctly, and still almost missed what mattered most. We were not just about to sign a bad deal. Ethan continued, his voice steady, but carrying more weight now. We were about to step into a structure built to collapse under us. That landed deeper than anything before, because now it was no longer about a clause, it was about intention, about being positioned inside someone else's design without realizing it. A quiet shift moved through the room, not visible, but felt, the kind that happens when understanding replaces assumption. Ethan exhaled once, then reached forward and turned off the main display, the screen fading to black, the reflection of the room replacing the text that had just changed everything. The absence of the contract felt louder than its presence had, as if the silence itself now carried the meaning. He let his hand rest against the edge of the table again, grounding himself, then spoke, softer now, but more direct. We are not just fixing this deal, he said. We are changing how we see. No one interrupted, because this was no longer about process. It was about perspective. Ethan turned his head slightly, his eyes finding Marcus again, not by accident, not by habit, but intentionally. And there was no distance in that look now, no hierarchy in it, just recognition. You said something earlier, Ethan said, his tone thoughtful, about patterns breaking. Marcus held his gaze, steady as always. Yes, sir. Ethan nodded slightly, then asked, what else breaks here? The question was different this time. Not about the contract, not about a clause, but about the structure behind it. Marcus paused. Not long, just enough to consider the full scope of what he was seeing. Then he answered, calm, precise, the trust, he said. And that word landed heavier than any technical explanation could have, because it was not written anywhere on the page, but it was everywhere in the design. A quiet stillness followed, deeper than before, not tense, not uncertain, but clear, the kind of silence that comes when something true is said in the simplest possible way. Ethan held that for a moment, then gave a small nod, not to Marcus, not to the room, but to the understanding itself. And in that moment, The direction of everything had changed, not just the deal they were about to sign, but the way they would move forward from here, because once trust breaks, you do not just repair the contract, you rebuild the way you decide who to trust in the first place. And standing there, no longer invisible, no longer outside the structure, Marcus Reed had just shifted that foundation without ever raising his voice. The word lingered longer than anything else had that morning. Trust. It did not belong to the contract. It did not belong to the clause. But it explained everything that had been built around them without being seen. Ethan stood still for a moment, letting it settle, not rushing past it the way most people would in a room like this, not turning it into a talking point or a strategy, just letting it exist as it was. Then he nodded once, slow, deliberate, as if accepting something he could not ignore anymore. You are right, he said quietly. It was not said to the room. It was said to Marcus. And that mattered. A few people shifted slightly at the table, not in discomfort, but in adjustment, because acknowledgement like that did not happen often, especially not directed at someone who, an hour ago, had not even been part of the conversation. Ethan turned back toward the table, his posture steady, but something in his presence had changed, not weaker, not softer, just clearer, more grounded in what he had just understood. We move differently from here, he said. No emphasis, no explanation, just a statement that carried direction without needing to expand on it. The team nodded subtly, already recalibrating, already shifting their focus from defending what had almost happened to understanding how to prevent it from happening again. Ethan reached for the closed folder again, but this time he did not open it. He held it for a second, then set it aside completely, not part of the process anymore, not part of the path forward. Schedule a new negotiation, he said, with revised terms. Transparent terms. One of the advisors leaned forward slightly. They will push back, he said carefully. Ethan met his gaze, calm, unshaken. Then we walk, he replied. The simplicity of that answer left no room for negotiation. Not here. Not now. The room accepted it without question, because the standard had just been reset, and everyone could feel it. Ethan stepped away from the table again, his attention shifting once more toward Marcus, not because there was anything left to solve, but because there was something left to recognize. He stopped a few feet in front of him again, the same distance as before, but it did not feel the same anymore. You said you read things, Ethan said, his tone thoughtful, almost reflective. Marcus nodded once. Yes, sir. Ethan studied him for a moment, not evaluating, not testing, just seeing him fully for the first time. What else do you read? He asked. The question was simple, but it carried something deeper, not about the contract, but about the person standing in front of him. Marcus paused, just briefly, then answered the same way he had all morning, without performance, without hesitation. Whatever is in front of me, he said. That answer landed differently than expected, not because it was complex, but because it was not. It was direct, honest, grounded in something that did not require explanation. Ethan gave a small nod, absorbing that, then glanced briefly around the room, at the people who had been trained to look at what mattered, who had systems and structures built to support that skill, and yet had still missed something that had been right in front of them. He looked back at Marcus. Most people only read what they expect to see, Ethan said quietly. Marcus did not respond. He did not need to, because the truth of that was already sitting in the room, written across every moment that had led them here. Ethan took a slow breath, then straightened slightly, his voice returning to its steady cadence, but carrying something new within it. That changes today, he said. Not loud, not dramatic, but final. And in that quiet shift, something had completed itself, not with applause, not with recognition spoken out loud, but with a decision that would echo far beyond this room. Because the man who had once been invisible had just redefined how the most powerful man in the room chose to see. The room did not erupt into action after Ethan's decision. It moved with intention, quieter, more deliberate, as if everyone understood that speed had almost cost them everything once already. Screens updated. Documents were reorganized. Conversations resumed, but in lower tones, stripped of the earlier confidence that had filled the space. The shift was subtle, but it was everywhere. Ethan stepped back toward the head of the table, but did not sit. His hands rested lightly against the back of the chair, his gaze moving across the room, not searching for answers now, but observing how the room itself had changed. It was no longer driven by hierarchy. It was anchored by awareness. "Send them a notice," he said, his voice steady, measured. "We are restructuring the agreement. Full transparency. No conditional ambiguity." One of the advisors nodded immediately, already drafting language that reflected that clarity. Another added quietly, "They will know we saw it." Ethan gave a slight nod. "Good," he replied. No hesitation. No concern about how that would be received. Because the balance had shifted. They were no longer reacting. They were defining the terms. Across the room, Marcus remained where he had been, the mop still leaning against the wall beside him. But now it felt like a detail from another version of the morning. People still noticed it, but not the same way. It was no longer a symbol of limitation. It was just an object. Ethan's eyes moved back to him again, not out of habit, but with purpose. There was no urgency left in the moment, no crisis to solve, but something remained unfinished. Not the deal, the recognition. Ethan stepped away from the table once more, closing the distance again, but this time slower, without the tension that had filled earlier steps. When he stopped in front of Marcus, the room did not react. It simply watched. Not because it was unexpected anymore, but because it had become part of the new rhythm. "You should not have had to say anything today," Ethan said, his voice quieter now, not for the room, but for the space between them. It was not an apology. Not exactly, but it carried something close to it. Marcus held his gaze, steady as before. "I saw it," he replied simply. Ethan nodded once, accepting that answer for what it was. No performance. No expectation. Just truth. He glanced briefly toward the table, then back at Marcus. "And you said it anyway," Ethan added. That part mattered. The room understood it, even without speaking. Marcus did not respond right away. Then, after a brief pause, he said, "If something is wrong, it does not matter where you stand." The words were quiet, but they settled deeply, not just between the two of them, but across the entire room. Ethan held that for a moment, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. That was the difference. Not knowledge. Not position. Choice. He stepped back slightly, creating space again, but not distance. "When we sit down for the next review," Ethan said, his tone returning to its steady cadence, "I want you in the room." There was no reaction this time. No surprise. Because now it made sense. Marcus did not move. He did not look at anyone else. He simply nodded once. "Yes, sir." No more. No less. The simplicity of it matched everything that had happened. Around them, the room continued to move, but the center had shifted. It was no longer anchored to title or role. It was anchored to clarity. And for the first time since the meeting had begun, nothing felt rushed. Not the decisions. Not the silence. Not even the space between words. Because what had almost been lost in minutes had just been redefined by a single moment of attention. And everyone in that room knew it would not be forgotten. The meeting did not end with a bang. It ended with a quiet shift, the kind that did not announce itself, but stayed long after everyone left the room. One by one, people began gathering their things, closing laptops, stacking documents that now meant something entirely different than they had an hour ago. Conversations resumed, but softer, more thoughtful, as if each person carried a piece of what had just happened and was still turning it over in their mind. Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer, standing at the head of the table, his hand resting lightly against the chair, his gaze drifting across the now dimmed screen, the empty folders, the reflections in the glass walls that showed a room no longer the same. Then, slowly he stepped away, not toward the door, toward Marcus. The distance between them closed again, but this time it did not feel like a moment of decision. It felt like something settling into place. Marcus had already picked up the mop again, almost instinctively, returning to the role he had come in with, as if the morning could fold back into normal. He adjusted the grip slightly, preparing to move on, to continue the work no one usually noticed. Ethan stopped a few feet away, watching that small, ordinary motion for a second longer than expected. "Marcus," he said, not loudly, but clearly enough to pause the movement. Marcus looked up. "Yes, sir." Ethan studied him for a brief moment, not searching, not measuring, just seeing. "You were right to speak," he said. Simple. Direct. No performance. Marcus gave a small nod, accepting it the same way he had accepted everything else that morning. "Thank you, sir." There was no pride in it. No relief. Just acknowledgement. Ethan glanced down at the mop, then back at Marcus. And you were right to see what we did not. That part hung a little longer. Because it meant something more. Not just about the contract. About everything that had led to that moment. Marcus did not respond right away. Then, quietly, he said, "It was there." Ethan nodded once. "Yes," he replied. It was. The simplicity of that exchange settled between them, unforced, unpolished, but complete. Around them, the room continued to empty, but no one rushed. No one ignored the moment, because it did not feel like an interruption anymore. It felt like the conclusion of something that had needed to happen. Ethan took a small step back, creating space again, but this time it was not distance. It was respect. "We start again tomorrow," he said, his voice returning to its steady rhythm. With clearer eyes, Marcus nodded once more. "Yes, sir." No more was needed. Ethan turned then, walking toward the door, not looking back, not because the moment did not matter, but because it had already settled into something that did not need to be repeated. The door opened softly, then closed behind him, the sound quiet, almost absorbed by the room itself. Marcus stood there for a second, the mop in his hand, the faint reflection of the city stretching across the glass walls around him. Then he moved. Not hurried, not hesitant, just steady. He dipped the mop into the bucket, wrung it out, and began to clean the floor again, the same slow, even motion as before. The polished surface reflected the overhead lights, smooth and clear, as if nothing had happened. But something had. Not on the floor, not in the room, in the way one man chose to see, and in the way another chose to speak. And in that quiet reflection, without applause, without announcement, the balance had shifted, not because power had changed hands, but because someone without it had used something stronger. He did not raise his voice. He did not claim the moment. He just saw what others missed and said it out loud. And that was enough.